Good evening, my name is Donald Spiers. I'm one of the trustees of the Fast Museum. And today I'm going to talk to you about the life and times of the Harrier, a project that I was personally involved in for more than 50 years. In his play The History Boys, Alan Bennett makes the point, through Hector, his inspirational teacher, that no place is more remote than the recent past, because everybody assumes that everybody knows about the recent past and concentrates on the distant past. Hector goes on to say, so if you were involved in the recent past, pass it on. Not for me, not for you, but for someone, somewhere, someday. And that is what I'm going to do in this. Okay then, the life and times of the Harrier. Let's start by looking at what our commitments were in 1960. In Germany, of course, the Cold War was raging. We had the Iron Curtain stretching all the way down the continent. The wall in Berlin between East and West. In Aden, we were very much involved in the Radfan War, where the Yemenis were trying to overtake our crown colony in Aden. In the Far East, based in Singapore, we were very much involved with Indonesia in what they called konfrontasi in Malay, confrontation between us and the Indonesians. So what were our priorities at that time? The Royal Air Force. Well, in 1960, the V-Force was still providing the nuclear deterrent. It wasn't until the second half of the 60s that the Navy took over with Polaris. For air defence, we had the Lightning aircraft to help defend the country. For ground attack and reconnaissance, we had the Hunter. Concentrate on ground attack operations today in the 1960s. We were worried about preemptive strikes by the Russians on our sites, so we wanted to operate from dispersed sites. And we were conscious that the enemy were developing quite capable low-level air defences, so we had to fly fast and low. 420 knots was a good speed, because it's 7 nautical miles a minute, which is 1 inch on a 500,000 map. This was all in the days before we had any GPS or anything like that, of course. Only had a map and a stopwatch. And we flew at no more than 200 feet, and usually quite a lot less. Because of this, the RAF had a great interest in what was then a privately funded project by Hawkers and Bristol Siddeley, known as the P1127. There's a picture of it up there. All depended, of course, on the engine. First idea came from Bristol Siddeley in 1957, an engine based on the Olympus and Orpheus, but having 4 nozzles that could rotate to change the thrust from backwards to downwards, upwards. Another picture of a real one there. So the Hawker P1127 design began as a private venture by the two companies, Bristol and Hawker, in 1959. They built themselves 2 prototypes, 4 development aircraft, and you can see the timetable there for their first flights. There is a picture of the first tethered flight. You see the tethers on the wingtips. Make sure that it couldn't take off and vanish out of the sight. Looks very different from the current Harrier, doesn't it? Another picture of one on a pad. And yet another one. So in the light of that, the RAF decided to have a trial and ordered an aircraft known as the Kestrel, developed from the P1127. They ordered 9 aircraft in 1963. The Pegasus 6 engine had only 15,000 pounds of thrust at that stage, later developed up to 23,000. Made its first flight in March 1964. There's the outline of the aircraft, and that's what it looked like. That's the Kestrel. So, we interested the Americans and the Germans in joining us, and we formed what was known as the Tri-Partite Kestrel Evaluation Squadron in 1965. 9 aircraft and pilots from those 3 nations And I was appointed as the OISC, or Officer in Scientific Charge of the trial. Grand sounding title. And it was all based at West Raynham, which is the home of the Central Fighter Establishment. That was our badge that we designed, and this was what we were after. Problems associated with the operation of V-style aircraft in the field, widely dispersed. There's 4 aircraft flying together. We found all the international pilots love flying formation together. Any opportunity they would do it. And there they are. Those were the pilots. The middle of the back row is David Scrimger, an RAF pilot, who was the commander of the squadron. On his left is Barkhorn, then Colonel Barkhorn, who was an amazing German pilot in World War II and had a total of 301 kills. On David Scrimger's right is Lou Salt, who was an American Navy commander who distinguished himself by trying to take off conventionally with the brakes on, which ended up in writing off one of our Kestrel aircraft. We only actually had 8 for the trial. Middle of the front row, J.K. Campbell, who was a great character, never seen without a cigar. I never saw him smoke it, but he chewed it all the time. And he referred to dispersed operations as taking the goddamned Harrier out into the goddamn weeds. There's Barkhorn, celebrating his 250th kill in World War II. They were practically all on the Eastern Front against the Russians, but he had a total of 301 kills, which makes Johnny Johnson's 38 kills, which was our champion, look silly by comparison, doesn't it? Barkhorn went on to become a general, and in fact became Deputy Commander of 2nd Allied Tactical Air Force in Germany. But he was killed in a car crash while he was doing that job, which was a great shame. Let's just have a look at the performance of the Kestrel with a 15,000-pound thrust engine on it. Takeoff, run, short takeoff, conventional takeoff. And if we have a look at the radius of action, you can see that taking off vertically led to a considerable restriction in radius of action. We can talk more about that in a minute. So we operated from a number of bases, operating sites. West Raynham was where the home base was, the home of the Central Fighter Establishment. An RAF airfield was opened in 1939 for World War II, closed in 1975, and became a Bloodhound missile site. Bircham Newton, it's a grass airfield, a World War I bomber base, used in World War II by Coastal Command 206 Squadron. It was closed in 1962. Stanford Training Area, which was an army unit. Interestingly, at the beginning of the World War II, it was owned by, well, it still is, owned by Lord Walsingham, who let it out to a whole load of tenant farmers. MOD requisitioned it in July 1942 for D-Day training. The tenant farmers, were given 1 week to leave and were given £12 in compensation. It's still owned by the army as a training area, and indeed they built an Afghan village there for 14 million quid when the war was on in Afghanistan. North Pickenham, best described as disused and dilapidated, and you'll see some pictures of that later. It did open in 1942 and had 3 hard runways. It was built for the American B-24 Liberators. Closed in 1949, became a Thor missile site. After that it became a Bernard Matthews turkey farm. Finally we operated out of Raby's Wood, which was literally a farmer's field. Nothing at all, no facilities whatsoever. Now let's talk about takeoffs and landings. If you're going to take off vertically, you had to have some sort of pad underneath you. We had a metal pad like this, or sometimes a plastic one. But you couldn't operate out of the grass because it blew up huge amounts of glass and mud and everything. If you were doing a rolling or a short takeoff, you could use almost any piece of ground provided it was hard enough, and we test that beforehand. There's typically what we could do to a green grass area. But you could use an area quite repeatedly, as you see, without any great problem. Move on and look at some videos of the trials. Let me say that while I talk to you about that there wasn't any video in 1965. We had a 16mm film unit to video the trial. Later in the 80s that was transferred to tape, then to DVDs, finally to MPEG. So you have to excuse the quality, but all this video between us, there's 4 shots, all lasts about 15 minutes. So let's have a go. So there's our badge. It is moving. There is our concept. And here you see Kestrel taking off for a vertical metal pad out in the Stanford area, flying away, flying past, low and fast, and coming into land. And you'll notice here on several other occasions, vertical landings take a long time. It's not as straightforward in and dump it. You've got to concentrate and let yourself down slowly. So anybody who happened to be flying past might think you're a bit vulnerable in that, landing vertically. Of course the pad itself was pretty noticeable from the air too, but we had some nets to cover it over when it wasn't being used. So let's move on to some operations in the field environment. So Bircham Newton, disused airfield, grass area, and here we're coming in for a rolling vertical landing, very quick and easy, none of this pausing and hovering around waiting for ages to land. And you could operate from a grass airfield. You could operate several aircraft at once from a grass airfield like that. Yet again, just to show you how easy rolling vertical landings were. Now he's coming in to try his luck at a pad, I think. Much slower business, isn't it? And you can operate several aircraft at once in a dispersed area. We never use more than 4, which is probably reasonable. And the pilots, of course, boasting and planning. And we see some of them start. We had cartridge starters, so you were quite independent of power supplies. Each aircraft was entirely operational on its own, and here they go. A flight of 4 aircraft going away. Now we move into the Stanford battle training area, and there you can see one on the pad and see how noticeable that is. What we were able to do later was to hide everything underneath the trees. You'll see some of that later on. But the aircraft left on its pad is very visible, very noticeable to any enemy passing over. These shots were all taken from a helicopter flying past, of course. Now there's an aircraft hidden away under the trees, and not very distinguishable at all. support vehicles. And there's the netting we've covered the paddock with when we weren't using it. Aircraft coming into land vertically on that pad. And again, I can't keep telling you how slow a business it is. And taxis away to hide under the trees. I don't know what they think they're pushing at, because as you will see, the actual pushing is being done by a Land Rover. And it could be refueled in the field like that. Preparing for flight, there goes the pilot. Sharp eye will notice this bit of film was copied with the film back to front. Cartridge starter. Here he comes taxiing out. I think the cameraman's a bit frightened he's going to be run over, that's why it's a bit jumpy. He's getting closer and closer and closer. And just manages to avoid it, and he's doing a vertical takeoff there, which, as we saw, severely stops the range, restricts the range. Away he goes. Coming back in for another slow vertical landing. They gradually got a bit better at it, but touch and go that one was. This time still in the army area, but a rolling vertical. Rolling vertical landing so much quicker and easier, and then you can taxi straight under the trees. Support vehicles. Okay, let's move on to North Pickenham, described as disused and dilapidated. It certainly is a bit dilapidated, as you'll see in a minute. It still had the remnants of the hard runways. Look at that. Bit battered, yeah. Using the grass there, obviously. A lot of weeds in the hard standing and on the runways, but no problem. So all the kit you needed could be easily carried around to dispersed areas. Ground crew takes over to refuel and rearm. Off we go again. There's that dilapidated control tower in the background. Cartridge starter again. Away we go. The longer the takeoff run you could get, the greater your payload could be. There he is using one of the disused runways for rolling vertical takeoff. Now finally to the farmer's field, Raby's Wood, which had absolutely nothing, just a grass field. Here's a pretty hard landing. How about that? Not very good at all. Take off. Here's a much better landing coming along. If you look closely in the background during the rollout from this landing, you'll see a rather damaged aircraft. We'll come to that in a minute, but there's a much smoother landing. And there's a sad-looking aircraft in the background there. And that was flown by the famous Colonel Barkhorn with 301 kills. He did a really hard landing and blew up the aircraft almost totally. Here they had to take it to pieces to move it. It was repairable, but took a long time. So, what do we make of it all? I told you they like formation flying. There they come again. And they really found no problems in operating from dispersed sites with no facilities. It all worked well. They did find all the way through though. Vertical landing took a long time, rolling vertical much quicker and better. And then you have a final demonstration of that with a pad here. This is back at West Raynham. Here he is just turning into a rolling vertical instead, straight in. Pilots could debrief in the open, and the aircraft could be refueled in the field. What happened after that? Well, we'd flown 930 sorties, 600 hours, wrote off that one aircraft, taking off with the brakes on. So what happened after that? Germans decided they weren't interested and gave their aircraft to the Americans. The Americans were interested. They moved the aircraft to Wright-Patt and also to NASA Langley, called it the XV-6A for further exploitation. There it is, painted up as the US Air Force aeroplane. And again. And as we all know, it subsequently entered service with them, with the US Marine Corps, as the AV-8A, later the AV-8B. Interestingly, the Marines were not involved in the Tripartite Squadron, only the Navy. It's the Marines who took it on, and of course they still have it. There it is. What did the Royal Air Force do? Well, the Royal Air Force decided they were right to carry out trials in both Malaya and Aden, where they were fully occupied, as we saw earlier, to establish the vulnerability of a dispersed aircraft. How hard would it be to detect one if you dispersed it out in the desert or in the jungle? So we've got a bit of video here for the trials in Aden. We used as a target, we couldn't use a Kestrel, we used a Westland helicopter, which is much the same sort of size actually, but a bit bigger if anything. Put it out in the desert, flew hunters past at 420 knots, as low as they could go, to see at what range they could actually detect this aeroplane. There's two hunters going off. Once again, this actually was 8mm film, all converted through. This was taken by me flying in a Hunter T8 across the Radfan Mountains into the desert. And this is what it's actually like when you fly at 100 feet and 400 knots. You bump around all over the place. There is a helicopter is out there, but you won't see it, no chance. So, having done that, the RAF then did some trials in Malaya using a jet provost aircraft as an airborne forward air controller. Decided that it really was difficult to detect a dispersed aircraft, so they would go ahead and order a batch. And the first batch of 60 Harriers was ordered in 1966 following those trials. First flight at the end of 67, entered RAF squadron service on the 1st of April 1969. There it is, first one, FR1. Almost immediately came the Daily Mail air race, from the top of the Post Office Tower in London to the top of the Empire State Building in New York. Quite a few people entered, including some very fast aircraft, Lightning for example. But of course they were all hindered by the fact that they had to land at an airfield, and the journey in to get from the top of the Post Office Tower in London out to the nearest airfield, and similarly in New York, meant that they were a bit slow. So that was the purpose of it. The Harrier entered. That's what it was all about. Tom Lecky Thompson won the westbound leg flying to New York, 6 hours 11 minutes. Graham Williams flew the return leg. A bit quicker, of course, because you had the wind behind you. Now I'll leave the commentary to the pilots.
Lifted off and went away very, very quickly. In fact, I got to the top of the climb and was wondering if my watch had stopped because I'd taken so little time from the top of the GPO tower to there. After the vertical takeoff, I rendezvoused at the top of the climb with some Victor tankers, and we refueled a few times at about 0.88 mark to 0.9 mark at 37 to 39,000 feet, which in round figures is about 600 miles an hour at 7 to 8 miles up. The air race was excellent, and superb control all the way down at the maximum speed and the lowest height that we wanted to go, until finally I slowed down before completing a transition to the vertical landing. Although it looked very dusty, I found this of no embarrassment because I was moving forward all the time and keeping a clear area ahead of me and underneath me which I could see. It necessarily had to be this form of approach to save time rather than a pure hover.
But we couldn't rehearse the weather, and on the actual day it was pouring with rain. Having got out of the Jaguar, I didn't really realize how wet I was. I was very hot, a little bit flustered perhaps, and of course I had to really slow myself down to make myself do the checks. I hadn't actually seen it before. I'd seen the landing site from a helicopter, but I hadn't seen it fully prepared with the pad in place. I was so relieved to see it that I almost forgot to slow down, and I inadvertently did a faster decelerating transition to the hover than I had originally planned. And I hardly had any time to think about the landing. I just flopped straight down onto the pad.
Okay, moving on, that's the final version, the GR9, ground attack aircraft. And they also then made a two-seat version, the T4, which was very good because it meant that I could fly in it. The Navy then became interested. They ordered a batch of 34 Sea Harrier aircraft with the Ferranti Blue Fox radar in. That entered service the following year in 1980. There it is. You can see by the nose that it's a different aeroplane with an AI radar in. And of course, most famously, Harriers were used in the Falklands War. There's a line up on the carrier. You see on the right-hand side lined up both the Navy version with the black nose and the RAF version with the long pointed nose. Both used in the war with great success. Didn't lose any aeroplanes. That's what the Argentinians didn't want to see. And then, in 2010, following a strategic defence and security review, so-called, the British government decided to withdraw the Harrier from service with immediate effect. And we sold 72 aircraft, all spares, all support equipment, to the US Marine Corps for $110 million. I can't help saying that's a sum of money that will not even buy one F-35 aircraft today. There they all are at Davis Monthan, all in perfect condition. Lovely place to keep aircraft, of course. There it flies on with the US Marine Corps, the AV-8B. The only one left flying other than that is the Spanish, which appeared at the Farnborough Air Show. That's the end of my story. R.I.P. Harrier. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. That's the end of my story and my involvement with the Harrier. All rather sad in a way, because we've lost the capability. We still don't have it in this year, 2023. And our pilots have all lost the opportunity to work in that role, so they've all got to learn again how to operate in that way. But there we are. That's an interesting piece of history, and I hope you'll find that useful.